Hi there, hope you're well. In this video I'll be trying to give you an overview of the nailer landscape. It's a basics video, so for folks who are new to making or looking to make a new purchase of a nailer or a nailer stapler. Now, nailers and nail guns can be quite confusing because there's lots to consider, from the size of the nails to the type of nailer, and none of it helped by the names we use: headless, veneer pins, first fix, finish nailer, cordless, gas powered, air nailer, plus of course the anomalies and contradictions. Gas nailers like this one still need a battery, and this battery cordless nailer actually works with compressed air. So in this video I'm going to try and cut through the cruft to give you the broader picture, and because of that I'm only going to be talking about the common types of nailer and nail sizes. In fact, let's start right there with a quick look at nail sizes. So fairly obviously a nail size needs to consider both the length of the nail and the thickness. Nail thicknesses are based around an old American wire gauge standard, and the higher the number, the thinner the wire or nail. 23 gauge or headless nails are about the thinnest you can commonly get, at around 0.6 of a millimeter thick. 21 gauge or veneer pins are 0.8 of a millimeter thick. Then you get the much more common 18 gauge at 1.2 millimeters and 16 gauge at 1.6 millimeters, and this continues all the way down to around 12 gauge at 2.7 millimeters thick. You can continue beyond either ends of the range, of course, but those are the common sizes. Now, the thicker the nail, the longer they can be. Very thin nails bend if they're too long, of course, and the gauge of a nail usually determines the range of lengths that are available. For example, you can get 18 gauge nails from 10 millimeters to 50 millimeters long, whereas 12 gauge are available from 50 to 90 millimeters long, possibly because there aren't that many applications for a short, thicker nail, and so on. It's worth bearing in mind though that the actual length of a nail you can use is determined by the nail gun itself. For example, just because you've bought an 18 gauge nail gun, it doesn't necessarily mean that it can fire 50mm nails, so check the specs carefully before you make a purchase, especially if you need to be using nails at either end of the range of a particular gauge. Nailers, staplers, and we'll talk more about those towards the end of the video, they often have a reduced nail capacity, so just be aware of that. When it comes to usage, 23 gauge or headless pins are typically used for fixing fine detailed work like trim or mouldings, and the fact that they're headless means there's almost no finishing or filling required, often with the paint or wax finish being enough. 21 gauge pins typically do have a head, so they can be used where a slightly heavier fixing is needed, perhaps with a larger moulding, but again with minimal finishing. 18 gauge is a good general purpose all-rounder nail, and one of the most common sizes, and most of the entry-level nailers and nailer staplers will be 18 gauge. It's a heavy enough fixing for a wide variety of applications, from lightweight, holding things together while the glue dries, to more permanent fixings, and the range of lengths from 10mm to 50mm will cover most of the builds that most folks will make in a workshop. All of my workshop drawers here are held together with 18 gauge nails, as are the birch ply fascias on the torsion box router table too. For a heavier fixing, 16 gauge is good, as much for the increased length of up to 65mm or 2.5 inches as anything. And here in the UK, these are called second fix nailers, commonly used for skirtings and architrave. In the US, you might see them referred to as finish nailers. And this continues all the way down to around 12 gauge, called first fix here, sometimes framing nailers in the US, where many houses are timber framed. And this gauge of nails and nailers are largely used for building work, construction work, like roof and ceiling joists, internal stud walls, and so on. So those are the common nail sizes that you'll come across. What about the kind of nail gun that can use them? Well, we need to look at what powers them next. I'm not going to get too far into how a nail gun works exactly. I'm sure there are plenty of YouTube videos about that already, but in essence the nails typically come in a strip of some kind, or held together, collated if you like, with paper tape, and these strips are held in the gun in a magazine which pushes them forwards with a spring. When it's their turn, a striker like a tiny hammer is released by the trigger and drives the nail into the workpiece. That's a gross oversimplification, but I'm sure you get the general idea. Now, when you're hammering a nail home with a traditional hammer, it's the kinetic energy that's created by the swing of the hammer that drives the nail home. In a nail gun, that needs to be powered by something else, and the common options depending on the size of nails are gas, compressed air, battery or cordless electric, and mains or corded electric, and I'm going to go through each of these in turn along with some of the pros and cons. Let's start with gas nailers. These are used extensively in construction. These could supply the power to drive large nails, but completely independent of an external power supply or generator. The striker in these nails is driven by the ignition of a gas, just like the piston in a car engine, and the spark that ignites the gas is supplied by a battery. Each pack of nails you purchase comes with a gas canister that hopefully will cover the number of nails in the pack, because without the gas you're a little bit stuck. The benefits of these gas nailers are complete independence of any power supply, so whether you're up on a roof or down in the basement of a building that barely exists, you can always work, provided that you've charged your batteries. The downside is that the nail guns and consumables aren't cheap, and the gas can be a little bit finicky, especially in cold weather. They're also not the smallest of nail guns. I've got to get way back here so that you can see them. And although, of course, the size is appropriate for the size of nails they can deliver, and they are much lighter than you might expect something of this size to be. So while gas nailers have largely replaced compressed air nailers on building sites, construction sites, certainly here in the UK, compressed air nailers remain a popular choice amongst small independent companies and one-man band maker installers, or indeed keen home woodworkers. With an air nailer, your method of propulsion is compressed air, and compressors like this one come in a variety of sizes and prices. And because this power supply is split off as a separate unit, the nail guns themselves can be made much more simply and so more cheaply. I think, as I said in my previous video about my cheap nailer and compressor, the reason I have this one is because when I was looking for a 23 gauge headless nailer, it was actually cheaper to buy the compressor and air nailer than it was to buy the cordless equivalent. Significantly cheaper too, by the way, like about half the price of just the bare tool. A compressor can be used for other things, of course, like moving dust around, inflating tires, or spraying if you've got one that's large enough. And once the compressor's purchased, other nailers covering other sizes can easily be added in at a very reasonable cost. The downside is that the nailer is always connected with this umbilical cord of air hose to the compressor, which can be a pain to manage in a smaller workspace. And of course, it's not exactly a portable solution even at this size. You can get smaller compressors designed for portability, but they tend not to be the cheapest or quietest of options. Like the old joke goes, there's a choice of small, quiet and cheap, but you can only pick two of them. Overall, though, they're an excellent option for a small workshop looking for an economical and flexible solution, and I've been very happy with this little compressor of mine. So what about battery cordless? Well, cordless has come a long way. You can get battery-powered nailers at just about every nail size and capacity. It's worth noting perhaps that the larger capacity battery cordless nailers are generally compressed air nailers. The battery runs a tiny compressor within the nail gun that delivers the power, as the battery alone doesn't have enough oomph. And this Ryobi 16 gauge nailer is the same, as is the whole range of Airstrike tools. There's a clue right there in the name. The benefits of cordless are perhaps the same as gas nailers: complete independence from a power source, provided your batteries are charged, of course. And if you can keep the nailer within the same battery family as the rest of your cordless tools, you can always pull a battery off something else to keep on nailing if needed. One thing I have found, certainly with the Ryobi range, is that the bigger capacity battery makes a huge difference. It's not just like having a larger fuel tank for a longer runtime. The bigger battery actually delivers more power. One thing to bear in mind is that because you're carrying both the power supply and the method of propulsion, these aren't the smallest or lightest of nailers. Compare this 16 gauge Ryobi with this 16 gauge air nailer, and you can easily see the benefits of having a separate power source. As always, though, the relatively affordable cordless nailers are the ones that are made in volume, and they tend to be almost exclusively 18 gauge. So if you've been looking longingly at that £85 special in your local supermarket, just prepare yourself for a bit of a jump in price if you start looking at cordless nailers in either smaller or larger gauges. So mains powered or corded nailers next. Let me just preface this by saying that in my experience, the entry-level corded nailers or nailer staplers generally have a few too many limitations to be worth the trouble. And again, just like the cordless nailers, the entry-level ones are overwhelmingly 18 gauge. In fact, I'm not aware of any mains-powered corded nailer of a larger capacity than 18 gauge, whatever the price. And please do let me know down in the comments if you know of any, as I'd love to take a look. The benefits of being corded are, thanks to a higher mains voltage, they can deliver the power they need in a much smaller package, as these 21 gauge and 18 gauge guns show. Obviously, you are reliant on being able to connect to a mains power outlet, but if you're largely doing domestic work in occupied homes, then they make great nailers or staplers to use on installs, as they're lightweight and compact, so can fit into tighter spaces or simply take up less space in the toolbox. As for the disadvantages, this 21 gauge gun tops out at a 30mm long pin, and the best this 18 gauge nailer stapler can manage is 25mm. Bear in mind as well that these are quality professional tools, not entry-level supermarket specials. Each one of these cost a couple of hundred to 250 quid, so be very sure, very clear about what your requirements are before getting involved with them. And let's end this with a quick look at staplers, or nailer staplers. Obviously not office staplers like this. We're talking about narrow crown staplers. Staplers are handy for all kinds of things, but especially so for fixing a relatively thin stock to something, and I use mine almost exclusively for fixing 6mm backs to cabinet carcasses. The advantage of a staple is that it's less likely to pull through because you have 6mm or quarter inch or so of the staple crown holding the workpiece down, as opposed to a pinprick of an 18 gauge nail head. As well as dedicated narrow crown staplers, you'd also get combined nailer staplers like this Maestri, and if they sound ideal, who wouldn't want two functions in one? Now let me just dampen that enthusiasm a little bit. One of the problems with a nailer stapler simply comes down to the mechanics of them. I've mentioned all through this video that there's a striker, a tiny hammer in here that drives the nail or staple into the workpiece. In a stapler, that striker has to be wide enough to cover the crown of the staple, and in a nailer stapler, well, it still has to be wide enough to cover the crown of a staple. So what's the problem? Well, when you use the nailer stapler as a nailer, the striker's about 10 times wider than the nail head, and you need to be very careful not to mar the workpiece with an indent right across the nail, because once that's there, there's very little you can do about it, especially in a finished piece. Like this Maestri, nailer staplers often have a reduced capacity in terms of the size of nail that they can handle as well, but they are generally available in battery cordless, mains corded and air powered, so you have plenty of choice if you decide you can live with their limitations. And I'm going to leave it there, I think, for this one though. Thank you so much. I think I'm all nailered and stapled out, but I do hope this has helped clear up any confusion you might have had around nailers and staplers, and perhaps clarified what you need to be looking for if you're considering a purchase. Thanks, as always, to my amazing Patreon supporters and YouTube members whose continued support really does help me to keep the lights on here. And it's the conversations that we have that help me to shape the public-facing content here on the channel. If you'd like to be part of that conversation, there are links in the video description down below. But that's it for this one. Thanks so much for taking a look, and I'll see you in the next one. All right, take care.